Welcome to the Business of Property podcast. I'm Stuart.
And I'm Simon.
We're both property people running our own businesses. This podcast is just us chatting, as we often do, about anything and everything property. Now, Simon, we said that at some stage we would do some little intros of ourselves. I believe I'm correct in saying that.
I think we probably should. We're now a few months into putting this podcast out into the world, and I don't think we've really told anybody about ourselves.
No. So now is the time. So
indeed. So I think we were going to start with why anything? Why did we choose property? Why did we get started? Seeing as I've managed to get that question in, I think you get to be the first one to answer it, Stuart.
Yeah, I can't believe you've just done that. I can't believe you've just turned the tables onto me. But I will for the podcast. So why? It's obviously a good question. I do remember the moment where I decided I was going to start investing in property, funnily enough. And it was, like many people, I was an accidental landlord, which means we held on to a property, which I always say is the only time my wife's ever agreed that I was right, was when I said that we were going to hold on to her previous studio flat. But back in 2014, it must have been, around then anyway, we remortgaged my house to go to Australia. So basically, as part of my sort of 40th celebrations, I wanted to go and visit friends and family out in Australia. And to do that, I got the house revalued, realised there was some equity there, remortgaged, obviously paid for the flights and everything else. And then we looked at selling the property and realised that, fortunately at that time there had been an increase in the market, and realised that would wipe out the additional borrowing that I'd taken out of the property. And that was kind of like the moment where I thought, actually, there's a lot to like about property. I've since learned there's a lot to dislike about property. I'm obviously joking, I'm being flippant there. But I realised that property works on a number of different levels. So I think in terms of the why, I suppose taking one step back, I had looked at a number of different businesses prior to property. And the reason I did that, without getting into too much of my story, which is out there on other podcasts and Executive Juice and lots of other things, was I had gone into corporate life, sought the big salary, the six-figure salary, had got where I wanted to get, or was pretty much there, was then looking at the next sort of senior position, and the next senior position was being offered to me, and said, right, okay, you're now looking at SVP, senior vice president, this. And I kind of looked at the role, and I looked at the person, people in those roles and the hours they put in. Not that I was shy of work, I was putting the hours in myself, but I thought, I'm not sure there's longevity in this for me, given that, I had a very young family at that time. I had 3 children under 14 months. And even then I was leaving the house before they woke and getting back when they were in bed. And I thought, this can't continue, because I'm supposed to be working to live, not living to work. It's one of those. So I started looking around, and I looked at various different things, franchises, other businesses, and I looked at a retail franchise and realised, actually, if I did that, I'd be working all week and weekends. So that wasn't going to be an option. So I'd looked at various different things. But then, of course, we had the property. And when I looked at the remortgaging, realised, hold on, we can start a business here. And obviously there's a lot of information out there about property. So that's kind of hopefully given some explanation in some sort of sense about my why.
So I think what I'm hearing in that is that a couple of things collided. You were looking to gain more control over your time. And in order to do that, you needed to meet certain financial goals without working every waking hour.
Yeah.
And from that, you were searching around for a solution, and property presented itself as a potential.
I think that's a good summary from my spraying of information out there. But that was essentially it. So long story short was, I wasn't unhappy in the work that I was doing. It was just, when you're working Monday to Friday, and including travel, we're talking about being out the house 10 to 12 hours a day, Monday to Friday, every month, every week. That was quite a lot. Since then things have changed. I'm still a consultant. So, that's what drove me to changing my life and handing in my notice. And I'm a burn the ships kind of guy. I wish I wasn't, but I am. So I hand in my notice and then think later. Fortunately for me, that worked out because I'd built some good relationships in my work, and I still consult with my previous employer, which has been a boon really, because as you know, property can be up and down and there's a lot of cost in it. But it was primarily driven, as for a lot of us is, once I had children, I had other things to think about other than myself. And those other things were little people, and even now I want to spend more time with them, because that's why we do what we do, isn't it? To support them. And I always think if we always talk about building and growing businesses. Well, why do we do that? Well, it's so we can have the freedom and or the money to work with those people. So I guess that's my why.
So it was really a means to an end. And you said you considered other means to that end as well. But you couldn't find anything that you thought would fit your desired time and money constraints. Is that right?
That's true. And I look back on it now, and I think I was a bit naive, or a lot naive, in thinking that I would just start investing in property, and within 6 months I could be sat on the beach with a pina colada, and not even to
maybe just Brighton Beach.
Yeah, maybe get that far, because in property circles we hear a lot about passive income, and my belief is that it's not so passive.
Yep.
But what I liked about the whole property thing is that you win in many ways. The first is, and without getting into this because we need to get to your why, but all I'm going to say is the reason I liked property was because you can get leverage to buy it. So you can't go out there and invest into. So for example, if I was going to get into a franchise and the franchise said they want £50,000 from me to invest in it or more, they wanted that whole £50,000. Whereas property, we've talked recently about loan to value. So we know that actually, if I'm buying a property for 100,000, I only need maximum 25% to buy that property. Yep. It then provides income, the rental income, which hopefully if we're doing our jobs well, we get more out of that. And then, if we're fortunate and we've bought well, we get capital appreciation as well. So the value of the property increases. So all of those things combined, and the belief that if I did something well, led me to believe that property would be a good vehicle to provide another income. That's kind of where I ended up.
And I think even looking outside the very optimistic property training market, property still is quite predictable as a business to plan in. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're considering taking a franchise, I would consider that a far more uncertain future.
Yeah.
But
there's just one, the word you've just said then, and obviously the reason we've named this podcast, the name that we've named it, is that you just said
that you can't remember anymore.
No, because I'm coming to the word business. You just said, when you consider the business, it's ...
Yeah.
Well, I don't think I thought about it like that. When I first went into this as gung-ho as I did, I wasn't thinking about a business. I was thinking about a property, developing that property, and then the next one, and then, versus, what we now talk about, and what I'm really focused on is about, okay, what's the business? What's the actual business? It's very different.
That's interesting you bring that up, because, when I started in property, it also wasn't a business for me. I certainly didn't think of it at that time as a business.
So, over to you, Mr. Pither. Why?
So, my why is probably a little bit simpler, although I have to be careful not to merge too much into the next topic. I really like property. You've heard this before, Stuart. Not least on a recent Executive Juice episode that you recorded with me. But I remember as a child, going around and viewing properties with my parents. We moved quite a lot. I think I lived in over 10 different properties before I left home. So that's a lot of property viewing, and in different countries as well. And a lot of the properties we looked at were new properties. A lot of them weren't, but a lot of them were. And I always really loved the fact you got floor plans with new properties. And of course, these days you get floor plans with all properties, but back then you only got them on the new ones. So I'd always really like going and looking around the new properties. So we get the floor plans. Parents were so fussed about the floor plans, so I got to keep all these floor plans. Brilliant. And yet so the brochures from these new properties. And I would spend time at home sort of drawing my own floor plan, my own ideal floor plan. I always liked courtyards for some reason, and split levels. I think I might still like courtyards, so I'm less keen on split levels these days. But anyway, so yeah, I just love property. I love going around looking at properties. I love the floor plans. If I wasn't in IT, I'd definitely be exploring architecture and that side of things. And even now, when I go on holiday or visit places, I always like looking around at the buildings and the properties that are there. Not just residential, but other things as well. I mean, I like big buildings. I like the castles, the cathedrals and things. I'm not a religious person, but the buildings are amazing. So yeah, it's my why for property is because I just fascinated by the buildings and the actual property. Even, I mean, your standard 2 up, 2 down residential terrace house is not as exciting, I'll grant you, but it's still interesting, and they're mostly different, and they have different characteristics or different problems that need fixing and things. So yeah, it's just interest is my why, and I'm going to stop there before I go into the next bit.
Well, there's always part of me that enjoys listening to your story, because I always feel incredibly glad that I've dragged my children to quite a few different houses in the last few years. But when I hear your story, I'm like, okay, well, it's not all bad. You know, Simon enjoyed it and took part of it. So hopefully there's that for my children too.
Do you give them the floor plans?
No.
No, see, they're all online now. So you don't get them to give to your kids to go around. Do you drag your kids around the houses that you're thinking about moving to?
We have done, because mostly, we've moved 4 times in the space of a few years, possibly more. But generally they'll come round for a viewing and then move. But I think what's interesting is that clearly there's an interest from you from a young age in what I would call the product itself, as in the house. Whereas for me, I guess I see property more as the vehicle to get somewhere else, but know that the product is important, because ultimately that's what we're dealing with, people living in property.
Yeah. I mean, I think to re-emphasise that sort of dichotomy, is that the right word? I've mentioned before on the podcast about a property that was a Tudor property in Reigate that was behind a restaurant and awkward position, listed and difficult to do anything with. It was on the market for ages. I was talking to someone else about it who's in the property business, and I was saying, well, it's a great property, but I don't know what you do with it. And they were saying, well, the best thing probably would be for someone to accidentally drop a match, wouldn't it? And my reaction was, well, from a business point of view, maybe, but you can't burn it down. It's a Tudor house. So yeah, I mean, I have no idea what you could ever do with that property. I could never justify buying it because there's no business case I can see in it. But yeah, it's just a fascinating property. Just for the sake of being what it is. Yeah.
So next part of the question then is, we've got a bit of our whys. When did you consider yourself a property investor?
Interesting that you chose the word investor rather than landlord. So I think for me, those two things happened at a different time. When I became a landlord was soon after I purchased my first house, and it was a 3-bed terrace house. It needed a light refurb, so new kitchen, new bathroom, and after I had done those things, I moved myself into the box room, which was I mean, it fitted a double bed, but that was the whole room. So I had enough space to walk into it and sort of stand next to the bed and get changed. But other than that, you're on the bed. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, the door on the room opens outwards. Otherwise, it wouldn't have even held a double bed if the door had opened inwards. And the other two bedrooms, which are double bedrooms, I let out to lodgers. And I think that was obviously when I started being a landlord, started my career as a landlord. Mm. And it was obviously, from a financial point of view as well, it was great because it started paying for itself as a property from the income from those lodgers. They largely covered the mortgage, and that was fantastic from a sort of business point of view. But I didn't really start looking at it as an investor in property until 2 years later, when I bought my first deliberate buy-to-let property. My grandfather had been in property business, as much as he had properties that he rented out to students in Brighton. So I was aware of this idea of property being a business and being an investment for quite a while. My parents also landlords, have rental properties they rent out. They never went into the student letting market. They stuck to single lets. But I've seen that the model before, so I knew about that sort of in advance. I knew that this was an investment opportunity. Started as a landlord in 2002, I think. I didn't prepare well enough for this to actually look up the dates, but I think that's roughly. And then I think it was about 2 years later that I. So, how about you, Stuart? When did you become a?
Well, it's I mean, it's interesting that you've called out the difference, because I suppose, reflecting on it now, I was a landlord. Well, my wife and I were landlords once we rented out her property. That was a landlord. But when and that was in 2007. But when I actively started purchasing with the intent of deriving an income from property, I was quite clear in my mind, at least, that was around 2015, that I wanted to be an investor, not a landlord. And I think because I saw landlord having lots of other connotations to it, which the funny thing is, I've got one studio flat, which I directly manage, which I spend more time on compared to around sort of 40 student/young professional rooms. Primary reason is that those rooms are managed by fully managed letting agents, and meant I could then focus on what we've been talking about, which is the business. I haven't focused on it well. So I would say, I became an investor around sort of 2015, but a landlord from 2007. So I always sort of say I've been in property around sort of 13 years, but more of an active investor. And for me, the investor part is just doing all the things you and I talk about, which is how well we buy, how we refinance, and everything else. And so about 5 years for me, I guess, as an investor.
So the sort of next part to this puzzle is how. How did we each get started? So what was the process for?
It's a good question. The process started for me. So I invest in the Southwest. The process started for me with, and it's a bit of advice you gave actually on the Executive Juice podcast. I don't want to keep plugging it, but when I asked for your advice to the audience, you said best advice is network, but also do something. Take action, and that's what I did as well. Which was bought a flat, which was relatively inexpensive, or a one-bed flat, which was, I can tell you, was £73,000. And once I bought that flat and had gone through the process of doing everything, then thought about the business that we've talked about already and thought, well, actually, one-bed flats aren't going to solve my cash flow problem. So what do I need to do? Well, I need to do multi-let if I want to create the cash flow I would like. And then the next purchase was a 5-bed house as an HMO, and which led to the next HMO, which led to the next HMO. But the reason I think that what you've talked about is so key, because for me, I had builders from the first couple that then, didn't work out, developed new relationships, got brokers, solicitors, which have since changed, but by taking those actions, I've developed the relationships, which is why I think, that is such good advice, because it's easy, to talk about these things as we do, but actually building relationships takes time, experience takes time. So I guess for me, that's how it happened really. 1-bed flat, then a 5-bed, and then I think it was another couple of 5 beds and so on until I built sort of 40 rooms and got investment.
So that first flat was, presumably you were looking at following a different model at that point to what you've ended up with.
Yeah, I think I was very much of the buy-to-let mindset. At that stage, it was, okay, let's buy a flat. And I think, again, because of the actual doing, the numbers were actually managed to refinance that on a much higher basis. But, that probably rents similar today what it did 5 years ago, which is around the £500 a month mark. So, that generates, let's say a couple of £100 positive cash flow. And then I suddenly realised, well, okay, if I wanted to replace my income with 1-bed flats, I'm going to need whatever, a lot. Yeah, more than 20 at least. And I thought, well, that's a lot of time and effort to get 20 of those. How do we circumvent that? Well, actually, it's what we now know to be the HMO model. That's kind of what took me there. How about yourself?
So I've already sort of accidentally covered it a little bit, but I started obviously with my own home, and because I purchased a slightly rundown house and did it up. When I came to be looking at moving into investment a couple of years later, there was enough equity in there that I could actually remortgage that. Or in actual fact, I didn't change product, but I extended the existing product, and that combined with the savings from IT career over that time gave me the deposit for the next property. I always knew that I was looking for passive-ish income from the properties, because I was continuing with my IT career. And the second property I purchased in a different area, but close to where my parents had buy-to-let properties, so that they were able to manage it for me. So I've always cheated a little bit on that one in terms of the management sort of supervision of that property. But yeah, that was the process I went through. I was really sort of following my parents' guidance on choosing that property as well. But again, it needed some refurbs, a new kitchen. I think probably a new bathroom on that one as well, although I forget. And over the years since, it's had new windows and some other bits and pieces as well. The process for those first two was so long ago now that I actually struggle to remember the details of it. I was starting to sort through old photos, which is a long overdue task I have recently, and I came across some photos of the refurb of that second property, and yeah, I was looking at something. I don't remember this.
Wiped it from the memory bank.
Yeah, quite. So yeah, that was a bit strange, but yeah, I think as best I can remember, that was the process for those first two, and that first one that was my home actually became a full buy-to-let property some years later when I moved out of it.
And is that the one on? Was that consent to let?
Yes, yeah, that's one on the consent to let on the residential mortgage.
Because I always feel like, and I could be wrong, but I always feel like you've got quite a good long-term vision, which I always get jealous of because I don't think I've got that.
I don't know where you get that idea from. I'm just making it up as I go along.
Well, it's good to know. It's good to know. It makes me feel better. I should add that when I did the 1-bed flat that we talked about, just thinking about we've talked about the rationale and the reasoning, and I guess it was just another one of the strings to the sort of bow that led me to believe that property would be a good route forward, was because The flat that I was looking at was originally on the market for 95,000, and I had followed it closely. In fact, I had gone to buy a property. For whatever reason, it fell through. I think it had a difficult freehold stroke leasehold on it. Another conversation. But it was on for 95, and then I think it went down to 90, and then it went down to 85. And it was one of these where when you're tracking it, you're like, hold on, I now look back on it and think, well, it's quite clear, the owner just needed to sell. And interestingly, they had just refurbished it. So I think someone had taken it and just needed, for whatever reason, which I never found out, just needed to leave. So I ended up buying that property for 73,000 and got that revalued at, I think, 90,000 within a 6-month period, which was almost a cash out. I can't remember the exact number, but and that was something else which said, well, okay, if I can do that on a property that's worth 70 to 90,000, what happens if we do that on something that's worth 200,000? And I think that was another thing that said, right, okay, let's focus on this as a bigger strategy.
Yeah, so that's something that I've never tried to do in my property purchases, is to go in with the idea of taking cash out. So I've always gone in expecting for that property to be a store of cash, but then for the time to erode that, hopefully, as grow that as property prices increase.
Yeah. Whereas I'm, again, the opposite end of that spectrum. I don't think I always enter going, well, okay, how much can I get out of this property? I hope in a couple of years' time that I'll be somewhere in the middle where I can just buy, and not have to think about releasing within 6 months or less.
Yeah. Having just missed a call from my wife, perhaps we should draw this episode to a close here, and we can carry on this story on another time.
Great.
Okay, so notes for this can be found at thebusinessofproperty.com.
See you next time.